மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. தேங்க்யூ.
We will now look at another option against the Panov but Finnick attack. As I mentioned, the option that I've personally played the most over the years, especially in recent times. And that is the move G6, of course. Now, in the previous chapter, we looked at the surprise weapon with Knight C6 or an alternative repertoire. But here we will be focusing on G6. And as already mentioned, the idea of this setup is quite obvious. First, we want to place bishop G7 and get this really powerful bishop on the long diagonal. And this is actually a really good setup for black if he can achieve it, if we can do this, because this pawn on D4 is going to be quite a target. So, in essence, actually, this variation I've played over the years with lots of success. When I was looking at my personal database, I realized I've actually only ever lost once in this variation. And I believe the reason that my results have been so good in this variation, as well as other players who've played this line, is because it's a very non-standard way of meeting white's options. For example, as I mentioned, white players are generally very well prepared against e6, which leads to the typical IQPs. Knight c6 is also quite a popular move that players have to keep in account. But this move g6 is a little bit rarer, and on top of that, it's not, some theoretical works consider this move to be imprecise or not very good. So what I found is that a lot of times my opponents may know the first sort of kind of 5 moves or so, know the white's idea of what he should do, but then find that they don't really know what's going on after that. So here we're going to look at 3 options for white, including knight f3, simple development, and we'll talk more about these, c takes d5, gobbling up the pawn in the center, going for IQP, and the most challenging move, queen b3, which is why this variation is considered, as I mentioned, maybe not completely sound, because here white is actually going to be up a pawn. And we're going to notice, actually, this is a common theme in these variations, where we're actually sort of playing a gambit, where white is going to be going ahead in material, ahead in a pawn early in the game, but will sometimes fall behind in development, or black will regain this pawn in the future with a good position. So let us first look at the move knight to f3. This has been an option that has been very, very common in my games, especially when I first started playing this variation when I was around 2300, and I was playing it around players who were 1800. And this move looks very natural. White is just developing a piece, but this is exactly the type of move that we should be very happy to see, because after the move bishop to g7, white has not done anything to impede our development scheme. So I'm going to give a detailed look, or we're going to look at one game here, and I've attached quite detailed notes on this type of position, because it's very important to understand why black is doing very well here and what plans we can go for. So in this position, white is advised to continue developing with, say, bishop e2. Now, castles, knight c6. So this is a perfect setup for black against this potential, or not potential, definitely upcoming IQP position, because the bishop on g7, as I mentioned, knight on c6, putting great pressure on the center, and this bishop on c8 has a really bright future where it can go to g4 and add indirect pressure on this d4 pawn. But as we'll see, black can also reroute this bishop to b7, a little more on that later. So, as I mentioned, when white plays this variation, the Panov by Finnick attack, generally he's going for an attacking scheme. He wants to get active piece play, but it can be quite hard for white to do this in this position here, because black is just very solid and not really giving any targets of attack. So, in this position, quite popular option for white is to play h3, and the idea here is to prevent bishop g4. As a quick mention, I can also look at this move c5, and more so not at this move, but rather at this pawn structure. Now, if for those of you guys who had a look at the previous section where we looked at the surprise option of playing an early bishop e6 followed by feint catoing, we've already known this idea. And the idea that I'll bring your attention to here is that, okay, we no longer have an IQP position, but this pawn on d4 is still a target that can best be exemplified by this move, knight to e4. It's a very nice move, opening up this diagonal for the bishop and getting the knight to a nice central post. So the next move, for example, can be bishop g4, adding pressure to d4. So white generally plays bishop to e3. And in this position, black has 2 nice options. One is better than the other, though, in my opinion. So one typical idea to keep in mind is the move knight takes d5. And a surprising strike in the center. The point is after d takes d5, d4, black regains the material, but this bishop will have a wide open, beautiful diagonal, and will have a strong central presence. So that's a good line. But an even better idea, and one to keep in mind, and one that we already looked at in the previous section, is knight takes c3. Pawn takes c3. So it looks a little bit strange perhaps at first because we're bolstering this pawn for d4. White gets to bolster the d4 pawn and blunt this bishop. But the key idea here is that we're going to follow up with b6, undermining the spatial advantage this pawn on c5. And after the well-advised cb, ab, black actually accumulates a ton of advantages here. Okay, now this bishop is a little bit shut out, but black is perfectly happy with this wide-open a-file for the rook, targeting this isolated a2 pawn. The pawn on c3 is backwards, and these light squares are quite weak. This bishop on c8 is actually going to proceed to go to a8. Let's say white goes queen d2, black just goes bishop to a6, trading off the light square bishops, followed by knight a5, and then knight c4, or just doubling or even tripling on the c-file. And black is positionally doing very well with all of white's weaknesses. So nice plan here against this move c5, knight e4, and then, okay, knight c5 is an idea to keep in mind. Not the best idea here, but pretty good for black. But knight c3 is, again, a very nice maneuver here. And honestly, I really like black's position. He has a positional edge. And in this variation is generally full with a lot of these small little tidbits, these small little ways to get these positional advantages that many white players are just completely unaware of, and I've had the opportunity to actually use some of these ideas myself. But we'll look at this move h3, the most perhaps logical idea here. And now we're going to play pawn takes c4, determining the pawn structure, bishop takes c4. So, okay, the battle lines have been drawn. We have this IQP on d4, and generally playing against isolated pawn usually involves three strategies. So one important strategy is to put pressure on the pawn, attack the weakness. You want to prove to your opponent that his isolated pawn is not a strength that controls central squares, but in fact is a weak pawn that suffers with from not having any pawn protection. So you want to put pressure on it. Another thing that one is well advised to do when playing against an IVP is to blockade the square in front of it. Make sure this square is under good control for two reasons. First of all, if one of our pieces settles on that square, it will be unassailable by the opponent's pawns. It can be a very strong outpost where the piece will exert a lot of pressure, but simultaneously not be able to get kicked out. And another reason is that it's very important to watch out for this isolated pawn advancing down the board. Now in this variation, this is generally not a problem, but could be a problem in some cases, but in generally speaking, as the pawn goes down the board, it can increase its strength as it starts to take away more and more squares from our pieces and gain some space for white. So, and the last thing to mention is that generally you also want to make some good trades, meaning that the more pieces that come over the board, usually the bigger the weakness the isolated pawn gets, especially in the endgame, where you can easily tie down all of white's pieces to defending this pawn. And this will also, of course, not allow white so much active play when he doesn't have that many pieces on the board, which is what white generally wants to do in the IQP structure. So in this position, there's a couple of plans, and my favorite one, as I've already alluded to, is to play b6, get this bishop on this nice b7 square, long diagonal. The bishop is exerting pressure against this knight, so which would pressure the d4 pawn. Also eyes this square on d5, which is, of course, the square in front of the pawn. And it's a very nice plan. And in general, in this position, what black usually does is really fights for these light squares, including d5, but also c4. So another possible idea here is to play this move knight a5. It's another interesting plan. And then after, say, bishop e2, the move bishop e6. And we're really, so first of all, we're controlling the d5 square, and now the knight can swing to c4. I've attached some notes on this plan in the accompanying PGMs. But for now, we'll look at this b6 move because I believe it's the simplest way to play. It would definitely be my choice. And for example, we can look at the move bishop g5, and I've attached some other options for white in the notes. But the ideas here for black, as I mentioned, are very similar. Bishop goes to b7, knight goes to a5, rook goes to c8. As the main plan, there's some ideas where the knight goes to b4 and d5. Again, fight for the light squares, fight for the square in front of the pawn. So I chose this game because it also featured a very nice tactic, bishop b7, queen d2. Now white is also making some sense. He's preparing to bring the rook over. He's preparing to maybe try to trade off this strong bishop and launch some sort of attack. Rook c8 was played to occupy this open file, potentially having some tactics with this undefended bishop on c4. White played rook a to d1, and now knight a5 was played. Bishop e2, And okay, it's a very nice position here for black because again, this isolated pawn, white has no compensation. White plays knight to c4, occupying the light square. Knight is very annoying at c4, targeting the queen side, so white felt obliged to trade and then trade. And in this situation, black is very happy about this trade since his bishop on b7 has infinite amount of power on the light squares and the long diagonal. But white had a goal, an idea in mind here. He played the move knight e5, so trying to play very aggressively here, going forward, not caring about the structural damage, not really caring about giving away the bishop. But now black crowned his very strong positional play with the tactic here. It often happens that you play well positioned, you build up your position, and then you get in a nice tactical blow. And it's a little surprising here, but black had a very almost winning consideration that he played in the game. Rook takes c3, so a temporary exchange sacrifice. And the whole point here is that it turns out that these pieces here are actually misplaced, and it just everything works out in black's favor here. After queen c3, knight e4, double attack on the queen and bishop. The white queen was compelled to go to e3 to keep the defense against the bishop on the bishop. Knight g5, queen g5, f6. So at the end of the variation, black picks up the knight, gaining 2 bishops for the rook. Now, 2 pieces for rook are generally considered a material advantage, but in this case, it's not just any 2 pieces. It's 2 extremely powerful bishops that have insane control over the whole board. And black simply went on to convert this game very quickly. After the move queen to g4, maybe trying to get some tricks in, black says no thank you, bishop c8. Now white plays queen e2, black simply captures the knight, queen c4 check, e6, pawn takes e5, queen to e7. So the material is, of course, black has 2 pieces for the rook. White has succeeded in getting this 1 pawn, but not going to be really helpful here. Plays the move f4, trying to hold on to e5. Bishop goes to b7, bishop's on this beautiful diagonal. Rook d6, bishop d5. Now queen a4 was played, and after this very nice move g5, white just resigned because his pawns are all falling apart. Bishop on g7 has been temporarily contained, but about to escape, and rook on d6 is going to be completely out of place and trapped. So not a good showing for white here, but a very instructive game from black. Let's head back here to actually the beginning to sum that up. After knight f3 here, again, as I mentioned, not a scary move, but one that it's definitely worth giving some attention to because I love facing this variation. I faced it many times from players all ranging from class B to expert. Some high experts, close to masters, have played this way against me, thinking they just can get away with normal development. What can be so wrong about just getting the pieces out? But after bishop g7, bishop b2, castles, knight c6. Beautiful position for black here, where white is really going to be struggling to justify this center here that's under a lot of pressure. We looked at the move h3 primarily, dc, and we talked about this IQP position where black's side goals are, of course, to put pressure on the pawn and to also potentially exchange some pieces. But another main crux of the position, as we noticed, is to fight for the light squares. We looked at the move, b6, but also knight a5, and then bishop e6 is a possibility that I've attached in the notes. b6, very straightforward, get the bishop to the long diagonal. Rook comes to c8, this fully open file, rather. Rook a d1, and now knight a5, very nice maneuver, getting the knight to the c4 square. Now black has a tremendous positional advantage with the 2 bishops and the weak pawn on d4. And white played this natural knight e5, but fell into this trap, or rather made a blunder, and black was able to win this very nice game. So that really deals with this knight f3 move, which I'm very happy to say that I'm sure you'll be seeing a lot in your games in this variation, but not a dangerous move. Basically, knowing the plans I've outlined here are going to do wonders for your game and your position, will hopefully lead to lots of positional crushes on your end. And in the accompanying notes that I've made for this section, I've attached a couple more games that really showcase how black can handle his position. Basically everything we've discussed, attack these light squares, but well worth playing over these examples because they will just ingrain these ideas in your mind. So knight f3 here is not a big worry. So now we're going to switch to looking at variations that are definitely more critical. Here the move c takes d5 is a more pressing option than knight f3 because white immediately tries to create some conflict in the center. He snatches his pawn off the board, and he's hoping to make sure that when we're going bishop g7 and trying to achieve our dream setup, that we're going to be not really be able to do that comfortably, but instead have to address the tension in the center. So the positions here are a little bit. White actually has quite a little bit of a choice of where the game goes. The move that I'm recommending here is bishop to g7. It's the way I've always played, almost always played, and leaves positions very similar to the main line and other positions that we're going to look at in this chapter. I should mention in passing that the move knight takes d5 is also perfectly fine. The idea here is to just regain the pawn immediately. This does give white the option of trying to create some sort of initiative, either with the move bishop c4 or the move queen b3, getting this attacking this knight at d5 and getting these some tempi early. But against both of these moves, after for example bishop c4, black should play knight b6, followed by bishop g7 and castling, and then usually knight c6. And with a perfectly playable position that sort of resembles the Grunfeld defense, which is a defense black used against d4, with the move 1 d4 and with a kingside fianchetto. It's perfectly playable, so I'm not going to be having a deep look at it, but I will mention it again. If there's something you're interested, you can have a look. But I just like bishop g7. I think it's the simplest way to play. It's very much in line with the other options. And to be honest, this move c takes d5 is comparatively to knight f3, which is what we looked at, the slightly dubious move, and the queen b3, which is definitely the most testing option we'll look at after c takes d5. Those moves are more popular, and I wouldn't spend a lot of effort on c takes d5, but we're going to do due diligence and have a look at what we should be doing here. Now, after bishop g7, white has two options. They're bishop c4 and bishop b5. Now, he can also play knight f3, then after castles, it will usually transpose after bishop c4. So, we're first going to look at the move bishop to c4 here. This phase this idea. By the way, I should mention that the move queen takes b3 is going to just transpose to queen b3, that we will look at in a moment. So, bishop c4, I phase this idea myself. White wants to defend his pawn on d5, and is just saying that, look, I know these are double pawns, but it's an extra pawn that's in the center, I'm going to keep it. But this variation is not very dangerous because white's pieces are actually not very well placed in defending this pawn, and black has enough more than enough resources to get a good game here. So let me show you how that goes. Castles. Now a small branch for white. Either he can play knight e2 followed by knight f4, which is a common idea to try to hold on to that pawn with all his might, or you can play this simple knight f3. Now, we're going to look at knight f3 first here, and I should also say that this is has been more common in my games. Now we're going to play the simple knight b7, so trying to go to b6 to regain this pawn on d5. And this is why knight f3 is maybe a more toothless option, because white often just castles, and after knight b6 plays the move bishop b3, giving up this pawn on d5. Now he can maybe try a move like queen to b3 to defend this pawn, but I'm not very worried about this option at all here. For example, after, say, bishop f5, I'm going to capture this bishop on c4 sooner or later and get some rook c8 in, and I'm going to have a lot of compensation here, or rook c8 is rather my idea now, a lot of compensation with the two bishops, and most likely these pawns are going to drop, so white players generally just play bishop b3 here. And here's an important instructive moment. Black has an option to regain this pawn on d5. Now, in most games, and the most obvious move here is knight takes d5, and this position is reasonable for both sides, but I think black is fine, but I think white is also pretty happy. For example, there's been some games where white goes bishop to g5 followed by rook e1, and in general in these IQP structures, white wants to get some active play, and it seems like here he's getting exactly that. These pieces are coming out, he's going to get some pressure in the center, and there's been some games, admittedly, I've played these games in Blitz, where I tested out knight takes d5, knight b takes d5, and it seems to me that white's position does have some poison, he does have some activity. So in my tournament games, I've always preferred the move knight f takes d5, which is a little bit stranger move. Maybe the knight's leaving the king side, and what's that all about? For some reason, just optically, it looks more natural to take with a b knight, and that's what all the players have been doing. Perhaps they wanted to play a b6, bishop b7, which is a pretty decent idea, as we've seen. But here I definitely like knight f takes d5, so an instructive moment. And there's two reasons. One of the reasons is that I want to open up this bishop on g7 right away against the center. And another reason is that, for example, after white goes bishop g5, which has been the most popular move here and the reasonable idea that we've seen, really like this idea of bishop to e6. And this is something we've seen before. We're fighting for the light squares, Notably, we're actually fighting for the c4 square that we've also already seen that idea. And this knight on b6 is, of course, very useful rather in that regard, as the knight can slide into c4 after a subsequent knight takes c3, and then followed by knight c4. So it's a plan to keep in mind. Of course, black will follow with rook c8 here, and then potentially rook e8 to make sure this pawn's not hanging. And black here scores very well and has a very nice position, in my opinion. And white's active play here is not going to be as active, really, because he's going to have to be worrying about the weaknesses of his queen side. So an instructive moment here I'd like to bring to your attention, taking with a knight, that knight f takes d5, a more unusual option here that I believe is much better than the so-called main line. So knight f3 here is not very effective as the simple knight to d7 and then knight to b6. So instead, the move knight e2 is more important because white is really trying to dig in and defend this pawn. And here I propose a slightly different solution. Now, the most common idea that is knight to d7 that we've already seen. But the problem with knight d7 here is after knight f4, knight b6, bishop to b3, this pawn is well defended, and white can actually consider playing queen f3 later on, and this would add even more protection to the d5 pawn. So black is actually we're going to have to start worrying about it if we're actually going to get this pawn back. And okay, in some cases we'll see that it's okay to give up this pawn in the center, provided that we get enough compensation elsewhere. But here it could be a little difficult to do that after some analysis I've done. So instead I propose a different solution, a move that I really like here, knight to a6. So the knight's taking a different route here. It's going to c7. Now, of course, if white takes on a6 and pawn a6, this bishop is going to be extremely powerful in b7. Of course, we have doubled a-pawns, but it's going to be not relevant here, really. We have more than enough play. We have the open b-file now. We're going to have these two insane monsters on the long diagonal, and this pawn on d5 is definitely going to fall after a further bishop b7, and then if needed, queen d7, rook d8. And very nice position for black here. Probably already better for black, to be honest. So white really can't take this knight. Instead, he can play castles, for example. Now we're going to play knight c7. So the knight is targeting the d5 pawn. Well, white played knight e2, so he's well advised to go knight f4. And now we're going to keep adding pressure to this pawn with the move pawn to b6. And of course, the idea here is that the bishop is going to come out to b7, adding further pressure to d5. So after b6, there's actually a second idea here where white has most often responded with a4, and the reason is black is actually trying to go a6 and then b5 and then potentially b4 and dislodge the other knight. So white plays a4 here. If he doesn't, then we're just going to play bishop b7, a6. So a4 has been played. This follows the move bishop b7. Now queen b3, and a very nice idea here, rook to b8. This so-called mysterious rook move, which means, why is the rook going in b8? It's a closed file. Well, this file is going to remain closed no more, because now after a6, b5, this white queen on b3 is really going to be feeling the pressure. Now, this is an idea that I had analyzed and found about maybe 2012, I believe. I actually found this idea, I remember, on the train when I was heading to the New York State Championship. I was learning this line, the G6 Panov. But checking the recent basis, I found the game played decently recently in 2014 between a Grandmaster and an International Master, where black used this idea. And I want to follow this game because it was extremely instructive why this plan was so powerful. So here white played rook e1, potentially targeting this pawn. Black plays a6, and of course now we see why this rook's on b8, because if queen b6, there's bishop takes d5, and white is going to be losing some material. So instead, after this move a6, white played the move bishop to d2, and now black played the main idea b5, just blowing open the queen side and getting these pieces distracted. So after ab, white actually played a slightly funny looking move. He played the move bishop f1, which looks a little strange, but basically I guess white did not want to take on b5 because he would be pinned on this b file, so he decided it'd be best to leave this pawn alone so this rook won't be so active. For example, after bishop takes b5, black has so many moves here that give him adequate play, but the simplest is knight f takes d5, again opening up the bishop on g7 and regaining the pawn. Okay, black is still down a pawn, but tremendous compensation here with these two bishops. The open b file, of course, is very effective here at the isolated pawn on d4. And once black wins one of these pawns, his piece activity is going to be quite superior. So, yeah, white decided to just go bishop f1. But we'll look at this game a few more moves after the simple knight f takes d5, knight c takes d5. Bishop takes d5 was played, so that he's giving up this bishop, but he's deciding, okay, I want to keep this pawn under protection. And then after the further knight d5, queen takes d5, trades. I've attached the whole game in the BGM, but black ended up winning this game actually due to the weakness of this d4 pawn and then the subsequent weakness of the b2 pawn. So a very nice idea here. Let's just recap. Not really much to remember here in terms of theory, just this idea here. Against knight e2, we have to change our plans with this cunning move knight a6. And the idea here is that not only is the knight going to c7 with the purpose of attacking d5, but also we're trying to achieve this break with b5. So we saw a grandmaster example here where after bishop g2, b5 was indeed achieved, and black got a very nice position. So that deals with going back here after g6, this move cd, bishop g7, now bishop c4. So we looked at both after castles, knight f3 and knight e2, and in both cases, really white doesn't have a bright future ahead. In fact, he can often end up on the back foot when black regains the central pawn on d5. And we saw black's bishops and his piece activity, but particularly the two fianchetto bishops can be extremely powerful, and white really risks falling into a positional disadvantage here that's going to be really hard to shake off. And yeah, I must say that I've had quite a few games that went this way for black, where I was able to sort of use these ideas, use this the long-term potential of black's position to win pretty clean games. So definitely have a huge endorsement for this plan. Now, an option here that's more testing, and an option that I faced around 4 times, so not very often, but still I must bring this variation to your attention, is bishop b5 check. Now, this is an idea that's very common in these sort of Panov, pseudo-Panovs that we'll see later. This move aims to cause some disharmony in black's position. For example, white's main idea is that this very natural move, bishop d7, is a mistake, because after bishop c4, the bishop here is surprisingly misplaced, because now the queen is not attacking d5, and this knight loses the route of going to b6. So it's sort of also a positional trap. Now, the move that would be best for black here is to block, of course, with the knight to d7. Now, the main idea here is this move, bishop b5, is exclusively followed with the following idea: d6. Otherwise, this move really wouldn't make much sense. Of course, there's that trap if black goes bishop d7, but if knight d7, let's say white tries another move like knight f3, already black can consider a6 or the immediate castling, but a6 seems like it makes a lot of sense. And black is just, either white is going to have to retreat this bishop or have to take and give up 2 bishops, after which, for example, queen takes, and this pawn on d5 is going to drop. Black is just going to castle, take the pawn, potentially play b5, b4, and then b4, and bishop b7. So just a very nice position here for black. So that's why white plays d6 here. He's cut off this queen. So white decides, look, I know I'm probably not going to be able to hang on to this pawn on d5, so I'm just going to give it away and try to get an initiative. Now there's 2 options for black here. The one that I've always played was I've just taken this pawn on d6, but I can also give you a really easy to learn option that can be quite a bit of fun to play, and also very easy, doesn't really require much knowledge. It's the move castles, a pawn sacrifice, basically getting this king out of the way. Now, if white accepts, which he really should, then after queen takes e7, now knight e2 or bishop e2, knight e2 I believe makes a lot of sense. Basically, black is down this pawn, but he's going to get, of course, play against the isolated pawn, and here he's also going to get time against his bishop. So the move a6 here is very effective. Now, if the bishop retreats to d3, then b5, and now next is bishop to b2, the rooks come to the open files, the knight can go to b6, d5, and just very easy play for black here. Of course, the price to pay is that we're down a pawn, but a lot of the times we're able to regain this d4 pawn back. In general, just a very easy to play line. Objectively speaking, I believe it's alright for black, but some of the positions can end up in a draw because you can just win this pawn back and trade some pieces in the process. But Also, there's something to say for playing with an initiative, very easy plan to follow. So this plan has been used with success, not just to make draws, but also black has some wins here, so that's something possible. If white takes on d7, I like the move queen takes d7 here, keeping the queen eyeing this isolated pawn. And this bishop here is, of course, after b5 going to go to this long diagonal. Here I really like black's compensation. These two bishops are, of course, very powerful, especially the light squared one. So that's an easy to learn option, just castling short, but it does entail a pawn sacrifice. Maybe not for everyone. Although, since you're playing this variation, you probably have to have some sort of risk tolerance, since we are going down a pawn. But the variation I've always played is e takes d6, because I think it's good enough, to be honest. And now, I just want to get this king castle. So white plays queen e2 check. This is the whole main idea. This is what my opponents have played. A couple of experts, a couple of masters. I've played queen e7 in response, the main line. By the way, as a quick side note, it is possible to play king f8 here. It's a funny line. The idea is you don't want to trade queens. You want to have a more perhaps full-blooded fight, although trading the queens is not necessarily going for the draw. And this king is going to take the long route of h6, king g8, king h7, and then swing the rook in. In the meantime, black is also considering moves like a6 and knight b6 and bishop e6, trying to control these light squares. So a kind of funny variation. I'm going to be honest, I've played this variation a couple times in Blitz, but I've just always played the simple queen e7. Now, the variation here reaches an endgame. White is advised to play bishop f4 to attack d6. Not that arrow, of course, this one. And black has to take, and now white has an option. Since this variation is quite rare, I just want to share with you the main ideas from one game that I succeeded in defeating a master here. But I've also attached an additional a few notes in the attached PGN. But I will caution here that, again, this variation is not very popular. And to be honest, it's quite possible that you will deviate with king f8, the wacky king maneuver, or the pawn sacrifice with castling. So, I'm just going to show this one game here, since black has so many choices how to battle this comparatively rare line. Knight g2 is played in actually all the games that reached this position, even though bishop e2 is considered maybe stronger because the bishop can route to f3. To mention, I added some notes here. Let us look at knight e2. Now, the king has to go to e7 to defend this pawn. Otherwise, well, black can stack it, but it's not going to be so useful here. Castles, and now knight b6. So it looks like this king on e7 may be in a bit of danger, but from my experience and from my analysis, there's really nothing to fear for white here, for black here rather, because black will simply play bishop e6 if needed to blockade the e-file. This knight will go to this really nice outpost on d5, and in fact, this pawn on d6 is going to be quite difficult to get to, because it can be defended by the king, it can be defended by the rook. Whereas in the long run, this pawn on d4 that's a little bit more advanced, it can be quite a target for our pieces. Plus, as I've already mentioned, this d5 square is a good outpost for our pieces. So let me show you how this game went. My opponent played rook fe1. Now I played bishop to e6, as mentioned. And he played bishop e5, so really trying to get at my king. Now, unfortunately for me, I made a small inaccuracy here. I played the move a6, which is quite logical, but it would be stronger to immediately play h6, which would ask white to clarify the intentions of this bishop. If bishop h4, I break the pin with g5. And if captures, we get a position similar to the game. But here I would avoid a key option from white, which I will now show. I played a6 rather. The bishop went to a4. And now I played h6. So what's the difference here? Well, we'll see. Bishop f6, bishop takes f6, and now my opponent played d5. Really desperately trying to go for an initiative. But, however, a stronger option would have been to play knight f4. And here's the key difference. Now, this is a temporary sacrifice because I go bishop takes d4, but white would have the option of playing bishop b3, and he's going to regain this pawn back with an initiative since my king will be in the line of fire. Of course, if I had not played a6, this bishop here, this bishop would have been on b5 and not had the c4 square since my knight covers it. But my opponent here chose the wrong plan, and luckily for us, this led to a very instructive moment. Because after d5, bishop to d7, it turns out that this king on e7 is completely safe from any discoveries, and black has just gained a tremendous advantage with this dark square bishop. Of course, this bishop is often the star of the show in this g6 Panov, but here it has no opponent, so it was quite a difficult time for white here. So he tried to play knight g3, I played the move king d8, and now bishop b3 because bishop c3 was threatened. But now in this position, my king may look misplaced, but it's quite safe. And I'm slowly going to get around using my really powerful bishop. So first I played bishop e5, and we'll look at a couple moves here. Knight to e2, rook e8, activating my rook. Now a4, rook c8, so my king is quite comfortably placed on the d8 square while my rooks occupy the open files. And after rook c1, knight c4, an idea that we've already seen, bishop takes, rook takes. Now I had the two bishops, and well, what's so good about that? What's so good about that is that after f3, my opponent played bishop f5. I'm simply dominating the board. My bishops in this open position are simultaneously controlling the king side and queen side, and it's pretty well known that rooks and bishops coordinate tremendously well together, very often much better than rook and knight. They are both rooks and bishops are both long-range pieces, and here it was just a devastating position for my opponent. After a5, I played bishop d3, knight to g3 was played. Now I played f5, and these knights just have no good squares, while after knight a4, bishop d3, king h1, captures. These two bishops create quite an impression on d4, d3. They're just slicing the whole board. Meanwhile, the knights on g3 and a4 completely misplaced. After f4, knight f1, this was completely exemplified, and rook e2, very painful for my opponent. The game had quite a fitting finish after rook d1, rook f2. This knight on a4 is dominated, can't really go anywhere, and this knight on f1 is just lost. And of course, these bishops are completely immune due to this rook f1 capture, so which would be background checkmate. So this was an example that I have good memories of. This is a game that I played in 2013 when I was FIDE master. My opponent was a national master, and ever since I played this game, I was very convinced about Black's chances in this variation. You know, it often happens once you have a good game in a certain line, you're sort of have very good outlook about the variation. That was the case here. Just have very good feelings about this. So again, I've looked at a couple of options after bishop b5 check. The important thing is to not play bishop to d7, but rather knight to d7. And then we looked at d6 has to be played, otherwise we're just going to castle and get some time against the bishop. So three options here. The first one is just castles, play this gambit with really easy development. The main option is to take, and then after a queen e2 check, there's this funky king f8. We already have these arrows here, which showcase the plans Black can take here. The king runs to h7. In the meantime, we're going to try to utilize this d5 square for our pieces with knight b6. And this is a funky line, but also queen e7 is possible, after which bishop f4 captures, knight captures, or bishop captures still gets met with king e7. The plan is generally the same: knight b6 followed by bishop e6. We're going to try to use the square while pressuring the pawn on d4. So that pretty much covers c takes d5. We looked at bishop c4 just now, and also bishop b5. And again, in these variations, Black really has nothing to fear. So now all that's left is to examine queen b3, or rather, well, in this position it would work as well, but the most precise move order is the immediate queen b3. And, okay, so we just seen that c d5 and knight f3 are really nothing to worry about, but as I mentioned, knight f3 is a very common option, and definitely worth examining those positions, because a lot of the themes there are just useful for your chess in general, especially how to play against this IQP, fighting for the light squares, which is one of the principles of the Caro Kann. After all, we do go c6, d5. So quite a lengthy chapter here, but a lot of, I believe, nuggets here for positional play that are useful for your chess in general. And now we're going to examine queen b3 in a separate chapter, just to divide the material conveniently. And the positions there are going to be quite interesting, and well, we'll see you in the next chapter for a lot of fun.
மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.